Hey, Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
In order to make beer, a brewer must first produce wort via the mash process, which involves steeping crushed malt in warm water for a relatively short period of time, at least with modern malts. Back when we knew far less about the science of malting and brewing, brewers developed a number of methods to improve their overall efficiency, a few of which continued to be employed by some under the belief they have a positive, perceptible impact on beer. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to discuss some historical methods, namely step and decoction mashing.
We speak a lot about ingredients in the brewing process as how to make different, unique beers, but maybe process is just as important, if not more. And I think mashing is a really good example of one of those really interesting levers that we can pull in different directions to ostensibly make, really different types of beers.
Yeah, while I've performed a few step mashes over the years, I've still yet to muster the effort to do a decoction mash, which absolutely speaks to my opinions about this method. Now, this is not a Brews Views episode, but given the topic, I have a feeling we're going to be sharing some opinions on this show. So, our hope is to couch them in actual data. And on that front, we are going to be going over the results of an experiment that you performed, Jordan, comparing these two mash methods. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up next month, April of 2024, one of my oldest brewing friends and the first, I believe, to jump from homebrewing to pro, in my homebrewing circle at least, Tommy Caprellian from House of Pendragon Brewing Company is going to be hanging out with patrons. In addition to making awesome beer, the House of Pendragon story is one I think will resonate with many homebrewers, in part because it was started by a homebrewer, and the fact it's still a successful business today, I believe, speaks volumes. While you may not have access to House of Pendragon beer where you live, Tommy has been in the game for a long time at this point and has a ton of great info to offer. I'm really excited for this session. To be part of it, all you have to do is make a pledge of just $3 or more by Friday, April 25th, 2025, as Tommy's going to be hanging out that Saturday, the 26th. All past sessions are stored on our private YouTube and Patreon pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would appreciate that as well, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do appreciate knowing what you all think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches and as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup. I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Fred Reynolds had some feedback after listening to episode 366, where our focus was on using gelatin to fine IPA. Fred said, "This episode inspired me to give gelatin fining a try for the first time. Quick, easy, cheap. Why not clear the fermented beer more quickly before kegging and start enjoying it sooner? When I mixed up the solution in hot water, I found the strong aroma very off-putting. Hard to describe, but barnyard manure is the closest I can think of. I had to pour it down the sink. To each his or her own, I guess, but sorry, I just couldn't do it." What do you think, Jordan?
It does not smell good. I definitely know what they're talking about, but miraculously, it does not seem to impart itself into the actual beer. That's been your experience, right?
Oh yeah, I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed the aroma of the like gelatin fining solution on its own. It does not smell. I'm not sure I would say it's barnyard manure, but it's definitely an odd smell that it's not terribly appealing to the senses. That said, like you, Jordan, I've used it hundreds of times, and I've never had that aroma or flavor in my actual beer. Similarly, I've consumed many different food products made with gelatin, and they never taste like that either. So Fred, while I understand your concern, if clarity is something that you are after and you don't mind using animal products to achieve that, I would definitely recommend giving it another chance. It's really powerful stuff, and I'm not just referring to the way it smells. Thank you so much for hitting us up, Fred. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brulosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Real quick, we recently released our annual General Homebrewer Survey, which we started all the way back in 2015, and we would love for you to take the 4 or 5 minutes to fill it out. I understand concerns about info being sold for malicious purposes, but I swear to you that's not at all what we're doing. In fact, all of the respondents remain completely anonymous. We're just nerds who like data. We like to track trends in this hobby, and admittedly, we like to think doing so could potentially benefit homebrewing in some way. The link to that survey is in the description of this episode. All you have to do is click it, answer a few questions, and be on your merry way. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on historical methods of step and double decoction mashing. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brulosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. It's safe to say that these days, the vast majority of brewers, whether from the garage or big commercial outfit, rely on a single infusion mash, and there are many reasons for this. However, some continue to believe that there are benefits to other mashing methods that were more common, arguably out of necessity, in the days of yore. Now, before we really start digging into that, let's focus on some generals of the mash first.
Sure. So I assume that most of our listeners know what a mash is, if not all of them. But just to recap, mashing is the process of basically making the sugar that the yeast is going to ferment. So to do that, we're using grain, typically malted barley, that we crush to expose the starch, and we steep that in warm water. During that process, the enzymes present in the barley or the wheat or whatever you're using are activated at certain pHs and temperatures, and those starches are then converted into sugar that's ultimately fermented by yeast, and that's what gives us, malty beer.
Yeah, that is fermentable at the very least, and it's absolutely essential part of the brewing process. Now, when it comes to the mash, there are certain considerations, particularly as it pertains to the malt that we're using. There's a term that gets thrown around a lot. We are by no means maltsters or malt experts, so as has been evident in past episodes, we are going to speak about what we do know, but not in a way that a maltster might be able to speak to it. So forgive us for any mistakes that we make, and please do let us know if we did make anything egregious. But one of the words that gets thrown around a lot is modification, which just refers to the enzymatic breakdown of the endosperm, which makes the starch more accessible to conversion to fermentable sugar during the mash. So if a malt is more modified, it's going to convert more easily in the mash, simply put, and if it's under modified or less modified, it's going to not convert as much. It'll have lower conversion efficiency. Now, modification, interestingly, I only learned this while researching for this episode, is measured by the length of the acrospire during germination. Acrospire is just the little grass that pops out of the seed during the germination process, which is the very first part of the malting process. If it's within about 75 to 100% of the length of the kernel, it's considered fully modified. If it's under 75% the length of the kernel, it's considered under modified, which will generally have, again, lower conversion efficiency, meaning less starches are going to be converted into fermentable sugar during the mash.
And this is relevant because they say that there are certain mashing methods that can better access those starches and convert them to sugars during the mashing process when you have a less modified malt. And so that's one of the reasons that brewers may choose to pursue some of these more advanced methods, because they're working with a malt that either came in less modified than hoped, or they're purposefully seeking under modified malts, which might be the case in some German or Czech breweries, because they really appreciate this kind of old method and the flavors they're able to get using some kind of advanced mash methods with the under modified malts.
Right. And we're going to focus on these different mash methods in a second, but I do think it's interesting to point out that something that was once done or developed, let's say that word I think is more appropriate here, a technique that was developed for the purposes of improving, conversion efficiency, of getting more sugar out of this malt, has now become viewed as being more than just that. It contributes certain flavor characteristics, and there are presumed reasons for that as well. And we'll get into those. But obviously, like we mentioned earlier, I think the most common approach to mashing these days is single infusion. It's super simple. You take crushed malt, you mix it with your warm water, and you hold it at a specific temperature for 60 to 90 minutes. And it's as simple as that. When that's done, you separate the malt from the sweet wort, then you proceed with the boil. It's very simple. Most of us homebrewers are very familiar with this method. There are a couple things you need to consider, and that's the temperature at which you're going to mash. If you're looking for a really attenuative, well-fermented beer, that's going to dry out quite a bit, you're going to aim for what's referred to as a beta amylase rest, or just a mash temperature of about 131 to 149 Fahrenheit. I don't know many people who are mashing as low as 131. I think typically if your aim is to get a nice dry beer, you're really going to go for about 146 to 152 Fahrenheit. We're talking about 63 to 66 C, something along those lines. And again, this is going to result in higher attenuation and a well-fermented or dry beer. Now, if you're looking for the opposite of that, you want something with a little bit lower attenuation, ostensibly leaving more sweetness in body. That's questionable, I think, in this day and age, but certainly lower alcohol content. You're going to aim for what's referred to as an alpha amylase rest, or a mash temperature anywhere from about 154 to 162 Fahrenheit, or 68 to 72 C. And for me, you're looking at something like a stout, oatmeal stout. I typically mash at about 158, which I think is like 70 C. And again, you're not going to get as much attenuation, which ostensibly leaves more of those long chain dextrins, so that it bumps up your body and ostensibly sweetness.
So, a lot of brewers that are doing the single infusion practice are kind of shooting in the middle, getting a little bit of beta, a little bit of alpha for kind of a normal level of attenuation. And so you'll often hear people say, well, malt these days is so hot, it's so modified, it's all almost converted after 20 minutes anyway. So why would you even bother with the step mash? How could there be anything left? This is in fact what the apartment brewer, Steve, check him out on YouTube, really good channel. He asked me the same thing. He said his listeners or watchers are, asking him, why are you doing step mashing? Isn't there nothing left by the time you get to the second step? And, maybe we can talk a little bit about step mash, what that is, and I can provide a little bit of context about why I think there is something to it.
Well, yeah, and I don't think, brewing, we often say it's just beer. Like, why are you going to get all up in arms about this? And so to all of our listeners out there who either love or hate step mashing, we're not trying to trigger you or anything like that. I have never experienced any meaningful impact of the beers that I've made using a step mash, and I've never noticed really much of an impact on the beers my friends who do step mashing have made using that compared to a single infusion mash. If there's a difference, it's not enough for me to notice it or to perceive it, as being terribly big, we'll say. But there are certain reasons. Again, this is a method that was developed with a real function of improving conversion efficiency. And it's very simple. You start your mash at a cooler temperature, and then you step it up through a series of other temperatures. And I know that people are kind of picky about what temperatures they want to do their steps at, or not or temperatures, but as well as how many steps you're going to do. You can do a 3-step mash, a 4-step mash. You could do a 2-step if you really want to. But it does have, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, because you have way more experience with this than I do, Jordan. It does have meaningful impacts at these different temperatures, at these different rest temperatures.
Right. And so, you could start fairly low with an acid rest. And at that point, you're kind of creating some naturally present or activating some naturally present acids. Those are popular steps. That's a popular step for Weiss beer. Then you get into the protein rest. That's like 113 to 131F or 45 to 55C. And this is a point in which we could theoretically improve body and head retention. Again, those first two, not that many American homebrewers are really doing those anymore. I think a lot of people just go straight into beta and then into alpha, like we just talked about in the last bit on the different single infusion steps that you might want to make. But the point here is that if the beta amylase rest is giving us a more attenuative beer, and that's via making these shorter chains of sugar, maltose, that are more easily fermented by yeast. If we then step up to kind of finish out at an alpha range, which gives us some longer chain dextrins, in theory, you're able to create a beer that's both, dry and attenuated, but not lacking body. And so this is a really good trick for like Helles or other kind of drier but maltier lagers, is you have a little bit of malt backbone in the background there that you might not get if you just did a single infusion mash. So for that reason, I might do a single infusion mash at like 147F for like a Japanese rice lager because I want it dry as a bone. But for something like a Helles where I want a little bit of body there, but I'm still trying to dry it out, I'll do the step mash because in theory, I'm getting the best of both worlds. And so when asked, why would you do this if there's no, convertible sugars left following a initial step in your mash, like at a beta rest? I'm taking gravity readings, every 15 minutes or so on my refrac, just to kind of see how conversion's going, where I'm at. I might, modulate my mash timing just based on these readings that I'm getting. I will see a few more points of gravity added during that second rest in the alpha range. So at the very least, I'm increasing my conversion efficiency, getting more sugars out of the grain, saving a couple dollars in ingredients, but also, at the very least, the science would suggest that we are getting a couple points of these longer chain sugars, which will provide a little bit of background body to balance a beer that would otherwise be super dry.
See, and I think that's where I run into real issues with that. The argument for a step mash is that we've done numerous just single infusion mash temperature comparison experiments, numerous ones that all return very real proof of a difference in gravity. And yet people cannot taste a difference between these beers. So you might have one that finishes, the beta amylase rest, or that cooler mash temperature will finish at, say, 1009 FG. And then the same exact beer that was just mashed warmer, 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, finishes at, say, 1016. And they are indistinguishable to both the brewer, who was biased and knew everything about those beers, and the blind tasters who had no clue. They just thought they were drinking the same beer, despite there being a very real ABV difference, which I think on its own is fascinating. Those longer chain dextrins don't seem to have this like sweetness or body building effect that we all believe that it does. And it makes sense that it would improve body and that it would have some other impact. But where is the perceivable component to that? It's just really confusing to me.
Well, I mean, it's on the margins, right? If we're getting 95% of our converted sugars from the first rest and then only 5% more on the second, it totally is reasonable that the human palate would struggle to differentiate that extra 5%. But these are the knobs that we turn as homebrewers to get a little bit of an extra, better beer, even if you can't tell it apart in a blind triangle test. And also with modern, electric brewing systems like the Clawhammer, it's so easy to just hit the button and get, a 15-minute, alpha rest at the end. And so for that reason, it's just like, why not?
Yeah.
If this required another day of labor, there's no way I would do it.
Well, just to be thorough here, we're going to hit all of the other typical rest temperatures when you're doing a full step mash. The first rest typically that you'll hear about is what's called the acid rest or a ferulic acid rest. And that's between 95 and 113 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 to 45 C. Typically, you're going to hold it there for 10 to 20 minutes. And this was a method that was developed as a means of reducing the pH of that mash without having to add any exogenous acids, which I think is pretty clever. Ferulic acid does get converted to 4-vinyl glycol or 4-VG during fermentation, which is known to have kind of a clove-like flavor to it. So very common in like Weiss beer and stuff like that is expected to have that clovey thing. Certain malts are going to have more or less of this ferulic acid in there, and so it could be that you do an acid rest, and you just because you're doing an acid rest doesn't mean you're going to have a clove-laden beer. That's not how that works. But it may contribute to a clove-like character when you want it there. During the acid rest, also beta glucans are broken down, so it can kind of reduce that gumminess if you're using malts that have a high beta glucan content. The next rest is typically the protein rest, which is gets held for about 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so at 113 to 131 Fahrenheit or 45 to 55 C. And during this rest, large protein molecules are broken down by proteolytic enzymes into smaller amino acid chains, which improve accessibility to those starches during the saccharification rest. This is particularly helpful, and this I think is important to note when using under modified malts, because it is improving that access. It's increasing the access to those starches so that it ultimately, the hope at least, is that it will contribute to better conversion efficiency once you get up to that saccharification rest, which is your beta and alpha amylase rest, which we've already discussed.
All right. And we already talked about beta and alpha. So let's just kind of quickly run through those. Again, that's like the beta 140 to 150 F or 60 to 66 C, just breaking down those shorter chains of sugar, making something more attenuative, more fermentable. And then we can go up to the alpha range, which is 160 to 170 F or 71 to 77 C. Again, we're getting longer chain dextrins at that point that are not as fermentable. And at that top of that range, at like 170 F, brewers might often finish there for what's called a mash out. And that's really just to stop the amylase activity. So I don't know that it really matters for a homebrew scale, but I guess at like the larger scale, it just means that they are like able to lock in that flavor and that conversion and just stop converting over the course of like the lautering so that they have a more like, predictable and stable product going into the boil kettle.
Yeah. And again, when you're thinking about this whole, I know a lot of brewers who rely on step mashing, but they don't use every one of these step temperatures. You can kind of pick and choose again. But looking at it as a whole, what do we get out of this beyond the, better conversion efficiency later on down the line? Is there a perceptible impact? Well, we talked a little bit about 4VG if you're doing a ferulic acid rest. So you could get, some contribution of that, whether it's a perceptible, clove-like thing, or maybe just a whisper of something spicy in the background that maybe you like. And it does contribute a different characteristic. That could be, something you're looking for. You're going to get better breakdown of proteins, which is, again, kind of associated with just cleaner fermentations or a cleaner flavored beer in the end. And then I say this with a pin in it. The alpha amylase rest, again, you can use that to modulate sweetness, presumably. I have yet to be able to do that. More for me, it's a great knob to turn to modulate the level of alcohol that's in the finished beer. So that's where we're at with the step mash. Again, I've never done a decoction mash. You have, Jordan, so I'm going to kind of let you run with this one. And, there are multiple types of decoction. You can do a single, a double, a triple. Again, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a decoction mash is basically a step mash. It's just that you're heating up a portion of that mash via boiling it versus bringing the whole mash up into these different steps together. Exactly.
So all you're doing is taking a portion of the mash out of your main mash tun, typically about 1/3, and you're bringing that to a boil, and then you add that super hot boiled mash back to the main mash to achieve your subsequent steps, as opposed to just direct fire, heat increases or like a electronic element that's would bring you to the next step at the bulk level. And so when we do this, we might do a step mash within the decoction as well. So let's say you're going from your protein rest, you're at your protein rest in the main mash, you pull your decoction out, and then you might actually bring that and hold that at like a beta rest for 10 minutes, 30 minutes or something, then increase that to a boil. You might just go straight to a boil, which is kind of what I do these days because decoction days are pretty long enough as is. So trying to minimize the amount of time I'm spending on an already long day, especially with fairly modified malts. I don't know that you need to do these extra holds of the decoction. And then when you rejoin that back to your main mash, it's going to elevate the temp because the boiled decoction third is hotter than what's sitting in your main mash tun, and it brings you to your next step. So, there are calculators online that you can find that'll help you calculate this. It definitely is challenging to get it exactly right. There are also, discussions around thinner decoctions versus thicker decoctions. But I think that generally speaking, pull a third, bring it to a boil, hold that boil for like 10 minutes, add that back, and that'll get you to your next step.
Right. Well, so something that I want to just focus on for a minute here is the purpose of boiling the decoction longer than just bringing it up to a boil. So again, this was a method that was developed, my understanding at least, that it was developed purely as a means of increasing or improving that conversion efficiency in the undermodified malts that were used, hundreds of years ago. And so they'd pull a third of their mash, they'd boil that, they'd add it back in, and naturally that would bring the temperature up to its next step. What a lot of people are doing nowadays, like you mentioned, Jordan, is boiling that mash, that portion of the mash for longer in order to develop some sort of a Maillard reaction or some caramelization, because that now is contributing something more than just conversion efficiency. It's adding those flavors, that toasty, rich, malty flavor that you're not going to get, again, otherwise, if you're doing a single infusion or even a regular step mash, because that's not being boiled. Is that kind of on, am I on base there? Or?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, if you've ever had Schoenraumer, they're in Bavaria, they only boil their decoction for like 1 minute. And then, if you had maybe a Pilsner or Quell next to that, it's a bit darker.
Sure.
And so I don't know how long they're boiling their decoctions. And I think they're using a triple decoction process. I'm not sure how many decoctions Eric at Schoenraumer is using per, given style. But it seems to be that there is some sort of relationship there with like the, more malty flavors that you're getting, as well as the color darkening effect as a function of the time that you spend in the decoction boil.
Right. Yeah, I think that's interesting. That'd be actually a really interesting experiment for somebody who enjoys doing decoction mashing is just the boil, the length of the boil, do 1 minute versus 20 minutes or whatever, and see if it actually has a notable impact on color, flavor, aroma, stuff like that. I'd be fascinated to see that. But regardless, I think it's pretty common to hold that boil for about 10 to 15 minutes. And again, the expected impact of doing a decoction mash is more than just improving extract efficiency. It also does, reduce pH. It's another method for reducing pH naturally, and it can change the color, ostensibly the flavor, the aroma of beer as well, because of the development of these melanoidins and caramelization as a result of that boil. I read somewhere somebody described their decoction beers as being malty but not sweet, and I think that's a really neat way of kind of characterizing what it is that a decoction is aiming to do when you're doing it this way, at least, or for this purpose, is that we've all had those beers that you can tell just were too malty sweet. And so it's easy to link malt and sweet together. But if you really want that malty flavor while still having that nice dry experience, perhaps decoction mash can get you there.
The time that really cemented the impact that decoction can have, as well as like the relative effect compared to decoctions process A or B, was I did a trip to Massachusetts, and I went to Jack's Abbey, incredible lager brewer in, I think, Framingham, Massachusetts. And they actually listed on the menu how many decoctions a given beer had. And I started with like a single decoction, Pilsner or Helles or something, and then worked my way up to a double decoction beer and then a triple decoction beer. And I didn't do a triangle test, but I swear with every increasing decoction, I got a more richer, maltier flavor. And maybe there is too much of a good thing, And so it's a lever that you want to dial it in for the relative style or, characteristics that you're going for here. But I mean, I swear you could really taste the difference between the various numbers of decoctions that were used, and the more that they employed, the maltier and richer the beer was.
That I would love that. I would love doing that. That kind of a comparison. I think we have to when we're looking at a commercial brewer who's making anywhere from 7 to 60 barrel batches. I don't, first off, understand how they're pulling a third of that to decoct it or whatever. That's something I'm not familiar with. But I do think that there might be just, differences based on our scale. So maybe a 5-gallon batch when you're doing a triple decoction doesn't have as big of an impact just because of the amount that's being decocted and brewed as a 20 barrel batch that is being decocted in the same exact way, but maybe that volume has some impact. I just want to throw that out there because there are a lot of people who are like, well, no, I swear I taste, like you, Jordan, I swear I tasted a difference in these commercially brewed, decocted beers. But maybe if we don't get that in home brewing, maybe it's not because decoction doesn't do what we want it to do. It may be an issue of scale. Who knows? And I say that just because I don't want to come across as me being like anti-decoction or anything. I'm definitely not, even though I'm probably never going to do it myself. I don't have the time. Now, for the experiment we're going to discuss in the next segment, we did focus on Czech Dark Lager. I think that was an awesome pick. The BJCP describes it as a rich, dark, malty Czech lager with a roast character that can vary from almost absent to quite prominent, malty balance, and an interesting and complex flavor profile with variable levels of hopping that provides a range of possible interpretations. Now, Czech lagers are traditionally decocted, due in part to their use of undermodified malts. So a lot of people these days, Jordan, I'll let you speak to this, still prefer brewing their Czech lagers using a decoction.
Yeah, and we're just kind of, paying homage to the traditions across the pond, as it were. But in Czechia, as I understand it, decoction is like damn near a Reinheitsgebot for them. They are live and die by the decoction, and it's not Czech beer if it's not decocted. Maybe outside of like an IPA craft brewer or something there. And so they really, really believe in this. And as I understand it, virtually all Czech macro lagers in the Czech Republic are decocted. And they believe it contributes to desirable flavor characteristics that really defines the Czech beer experience. And they are, purposefully selecting undermodified malts. So it helps compensate for that variation in grain quality, giving them a more consistent and predictable beer.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, having recently visited Czechia and I drank every beer I could find there. I don't care if it's from Pilsner or Quell or some other brewery that I had never heard of. They are all insanely good. And I mean, at least when it comes to the lagers, I mean, they have craft breweries out there who are doing the same thing some craft brewers out here are doing, home brewers trying to go pro. That's all good. There's some great craft breweries out there as well. But man, you go over to the Czech Republic and you drink their lagers and it is a different experience. And maybe that's because, in part at least, due to the decoction. Now, I've brewed many Czech lagers over the years, including Czech Dark Lager, the majority of which I relied on a simple single infusion mash, and I have been very pleased with the outcome. I also have friends who lean a bit more into tradition than I do, and the lagers they've made using step or decoction mashing have never really seemed that different, as good as they were to my palate. Now, we've already discussed one past experiment looking at triple decoction versus single infusion mashing. That was on episode 103 for anybody who's interested. Spoiler alert, it was not significant. Now, more recently, you were interested in comparing beers that were made using either a step mash or a double decoction mash, and you performed an experiment to test that out. We're going to get into those results right after this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Are you opening a brewery or have you already? Did you know More Beer has a pro division? MoreBeerPro.com is your brewery or brewery in planning one-stop shop for all your brewing needs. From complete brew houses and accessories to fermentation and even cooperage, they've got you covered. More Beer also has the largest selection of malt, hops, chemicals, and other brewing products of any vendor at low wholesale prices, all of which can be delivered on the same pallet, saving you and your brewery even more on shipping costs. Visit MoreBeerPro.com today to sign up for an account and talk with one of their knowledgeable brewery consultants.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. I have to imagine most modern brewers would agree that excellent versions of Czech or really any other European lager can be made using a single infusion mash, but there are some who feel that a step or a decoction mash lends a particular uniqueness that can't be had otherwise. Jordan, while you were obviously among the latter group of brewers, you were curious about how these two historical mashing methods compare and put it to the test.
Right. I'm just as skeptical as the next guy. Does it really make a difference? It's a lot of work. Well, let's find out. So this is kind of my house Czech Dark Lager recipe. I absolutely love this recipe. I will give the credit where credit is due. This is actually modified from Ashley Carter's Bierstadt Lager House's Czech Dark Lager recipe. She did a homebrew presentation to one of the clubs here and was kind enough to give me her recipe. And wow, this is an incredible recipe, so highly recommend it. So we're looking at 46% Vienna malt, 28% Czech Pilsner malt, 19% Iseria 1924 malt. That's from Weyermann. That's like a esoteric Pilsner malt that they make. 5% Carafa Special 3 and 2% Cara Munich 2. And I will note that the Carafa is held off until the mash out step, so it's not decocted. And I will also say that the Czech Pils and the Iseria combo was actually a bit of a just a pivot because I had both on hand and I wanted to really increase the malt complexity. You can just use a single Pilsner malt. You don't need to necessarily split that up in future iterations.
So I believe you use the souffle Czech Pils malt, if I'm not mistaken. Is that an under-modified malt? And is the Iseria, I've never heard of that before you did this. Is that malt under-modified, or are they well-modified, or do you know?
Actually, that's a really good point. Yes, I believe both of those are under-modified. I don't know if either are floor malted, which can contribute to under-modification, but you could still have a kind of standard malting process that's under-modified. The Iseria 1924 malt is like a heritage variety that they've resurrected, and it's from the days of yesteryear and ostensibly less modified as a result.
Interesting. Yeah. I'll have to get my hands on some of that once I get my brewery back up and running over here. I would love to try some of that Iseria just to see what it tastes like. This being a variable that is introduced during the mash, we're going to talk about that right now. So go ahead and walk us through how, the process for each of these batches. And this brew day just must have been hectic as hell, I would imagine.
Yeah, brewing one decocted beer is enough, but brewing 2 beers at the same time really adds to the fun. So for the step mash, we're looking at a fairly standard approach here of 144F or 62C for 45 minutes. We're then going to raise that to 157F or 69C for another 30 minutes. And then we're going to finish with the mash out at 170F or 77C for 10 minutes. So one of the batches was I just used the claw hammer controller to raise those temperatures in sequence in place. Whereas the other batch, I had to pull out a third of the mash to then bring it to a boil, the decoction step, and add it back in to achieve those same temperatures. And I actually did a pretty good job, and I was able to hit those same temperatures using this decoction mash method with 1/3 being pulled. So that meant 45 minutes at 144F or 62C, removed a third of the mash, boiled that for 15 minutes, added that back to the main mash, was able to hit 157F or 69C, and then after 30 minutes, removed a portion of the mash again, boiled for 15 minutes, then added that back to the main mash to hit that 170F or 77C. And then again, it wasn't until that final mash out 10-minute step that I added the Carafa 3 that I ground up. And that is a trick I learned from Ashley, and that means that you're getting that color, but minimizing any extraction of roasty character, which is really the balance that I like in my Czech Dark Lager.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting step, particularly considering you use the Carafa Special, which is noted as it's a dehusked Carafa or roasted grain. And a lot of people believe that most of the roasty, kind of the burnt, ashy character you get from dark roasted grains comes from the husk. So if you remove that, you're getting more of a rich roasty character. And yet still, you're really just aiming for color here with very minimal, it sounds like at least, minimal roasted or chocolate character.
Now it's off to the boil. We are just boiling for 60 minutes, 85 grams of Czech Sots at 60 minutes, and then 43 grams of Czech Sots at 40 minutes. So after that boil, these worts were chilled and then transferred to separate fermentation kegs. And already we're starting to see a difference. We saw that the step mash hit 1052 OG, whereas the double decoction was 1060 OG. And this is no surprise to me. You know, that's the whole point, is that this double decoction, or any decoction for that matter, should increase the OG. There's a couple reasons there. One is perhaps it's, doing a better job of converting, but also you're boiling off some of the liquid, so you're concentrating it. So maybe there might be some differences in like IBUs because, there's different volumes of liquid that the same amount of hops are hitting. But addition, there's, just less liquid to begin with. So, you're going to have a stronger beer if you're going to decoct it. And to counteract that, to make things otherwise all equal, I made sure to only collect the same amount of volume into the two kegs because, we're already looking at a difference in terms of the total volume collected.
Yeah, that's. I think it's good to point out that the decoction being the double decocted batch having 8 points more specific gravity or OG at the start is interesting, but it's not just because of the conversion, the improved conversion that you get from doing a decoction. It is also because you were boiling off more of that, where you weren't boiling the step mash at all. So you weren't losing, liquid to evaporation as much as you were with the double decoction. And I know that it's probably going to come up later, but that's probably where a good portion of this higher OG came from, I would imagine.
Perhaps. So these worts were finished chilling in my fermentation chamber because I can't get it all the way down with my, coil chiller or whatever I was using that day. So I got that down to 50F or 10C, and then I pitched 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel into these beers. I probably also used ALDC because Urkel can throw a little bit of diacetyl, although that's, regionally acceptable. I don't want it in my beer. I'm trying to make diacetyl-free Czech Dark Lager.
Amen to that. So you pitched 2 pouches of Urkel because you didn't want to make a starter. So ultimately you're using 4 pouches. That's one way to get those, your cell count up, your pitch rate up to where it needs to be for a cool fermented lager. So everything seems to be going exactly how it should be at this point. Great.
So after a week of fermentation, plenty of attenuation points had occurred, so I start to gradually raise that temp up to 62F or 17C over the course of the following 2 weeks, ensuring that we have sufficient time for diacetyl rest and ensuring complete attenuation. And ultimately, after this was finished, I start gradually reducing it back down to 31F or negative 0.5C for that lagering phase. And along the way, I took a hydrometer measurement to see how attenuation looked. And I got to tell you, Marshall, I was pretty surprised.
So was I. Tell us about this, because I think this is where really the most interesting stuff starts to come out here.
Right. So we see the step mash at 1015 FG. And given the lower starting OG that it had, which was 1052 OG, that means it's an ABV of 4.9%. So the decoction mash ended at 1020 FG. And they say that decoction should create a drier beer. Not only is it increasing conversion efficiency, but OG, but it should also be increasing the attenuation potential, aka the FG. And yet here we go, we have a decoction batch that has a higher finishing gravity than the step mash. However, when you calculate the ABVs, it actually did attenuate more. So decoction's going from 1060 to 1020. That's 5.3% ABV relative to a step mash of 4.9. So it did do both. It did increase the conversion efficiency, so higher OG, and then it did increase the attenuation potential, ultimately with 0.4 ABV more present in the decoction batch.
So what I find so interesting is, in my experience doing single infusion mashes, I have made, 1060 OG or even higher beers that finish way lower than 1020. I mean, under 1010 even, FG. So the fact that this double decoction, it attenuated slightly more than the step mash batch, but it didn't attenuate nearly as much as I thought it would, or as much as I would have expected based on the method being used to mash it. That just is fascinating to me because, I'm thinking back to the original reasons brewers came up with this decoction mash method in the first place, which was to improve conversion efficiency and attenuation. And in this case, you could argue that it did that, and yet you could also kind of argue that it didn't do that, right?
A couple important caveats here. One is Czech lager yeast are not as attenuative as like Chico, or let alone a diastatic, strain like Saison, right? Additionally, I'm using lower modified malts, the majority of which weren't even like the highly modified Pilsner. I think Vienna was the most used malt, right? And so these styles are supposed to finish around that 10-15, 10-18 range anyway. So it kind of did what it was supposed to do, which is a function of the ingredients used.
Yeah, fascinating objective findings here. I love when stuff comes back like this, and then we still have to get to, well, what did people taste? Did they taste a difference, right? So at this point, though, I believe you kegged these beers and you did your typical very good low oxygen ingress version of packaging to CO2 purged kegs and all of that stuff, and then you let them lager for what, a month or so?
That's right. And at that point, they were ready for evaluation. And Marshall, I got to tell you, these beers were amazing. In terms of appearance, they looked incredible, identical, medium brown color with a creamy tan head, brilliantly clear. And just looking at them, sniffing them, it looks like these are going to be really good beers. But do they actually taste any different?
I'm looking at the picture right now, and I'll be honest, with a paler beer, I would expect to see some color variation between a step mash and a double decoction mash. I don't see that in these darker beers, but again, they are darker, so it may just hide that small difference in color. Would you say? I mean, did you notice with your real, seeing the actual beers themselves, did you notice any difference in color? Or?
Nah, I couldn't tell a difference. So I think that if I had made maybe a Czech Pale Lager, even a Czech Amber Lager, maybe we would have been able to see a difference. But at this SRM, it just, the naked human eye couldn't tell a difference.
Yeah, that's what I figured. And it may very well be that there was a difference if you hadn't used those darker grains, and that's fine. This wasn't a test of color variation. So, but before we do the experiment results and, serve these to blind tasters, we always do our own set of semi-blind triangle tests. Please tell us what your experience was like doing those triangle tests.
All right, so side by side, I thought I was getting a richer malt character out of the decocted batch, maybe even sweeter, given that FG, higher FG. But when I went blind, I sucked. I got 1 out of 5 right, and I just couldn't reliably taste these apart. They both tasted crisp and clean, caramely malt flavor, light roast backbone. Great examples of Czech Dark Lager, but kind of had me wondering, well, is this decoction thing actually worth it if I can't tell the difference?
I was wondering that when you were doing the experiment. So after you did that, I first off, we always do this stuff, and we'll often talk about our experience in a chat group or something. Oh man, I just did these, blind triangle tests and I didn't get it. And then we kind of start to presume, I wonder, how are the participants going to do when they don't know anything about these beers? They're just doing a regular old triangle test. In this case, you served the triangle test to 24 participants, out of which 13 would be expected to be able to identify the odd beer out in order for us to say with some level of confidence that these beers do seem to be meaningfully different. And in the end, how many people actually were able to get the triangle test right?
14 or 58% of tasters were able to reliably tell these beers apart, indicating that it was a significant difference and that the average taster can tend to tell the difference between a step mashed Czech Dark Lager and this double decocted Czech Dark Lager. I was pretty astonished, but I got to tell you, when I talked to tasters, those that were getting it right were like, "Are you kidding? This is super obvious." And so I guess that speaks to my palate that I just wasn't as tuned in as the people I shared this with.
I would have loved to have done the triangle test on this one because I just don't like the arguments for a double decoction. In my opinion, they kind of make sense, but all of the double decocted or even triple decocted beers that I've tasted, I don't have the experience that you had at Jack's Abbey. To me, I'm just like, you could have probably made this by adding maybe a little bit, just doing a 60-minute, single infusion. If you really wanted to add some melanoid and malt or something like that, by all means, but it's just such an interesting finding that comparing a step mash to a double decoction, we've got this significant finding. It blows my mind, especially in light of the fact that our triple decoction experiment compared to a single infusion was not significant. People could not tell those beers apart. Fascinating result.
And remind me, Marshall, what was the style for that triple decoction?
Oh man, I forget. Malcolm did that one, and I think he was brewing a lot of Weiss beer at the time, so it might have been a more characterful beer. We'd have to look that one up, but I'm not sure.
Well, either way, I guarantee you he wasn't using the Czech Soufflé and Iseria 1924 malt. So maybe there is a bit of a confounding, comparison here, which is the malts that were used, and maybe even the yeast that was used. So at least in this case, tasters could reliably tell them apart. I know you hate it, but I kind of love it. We got the preference question. And, hey, if you got to decoct your Czech lager, surely more people prefer that, right? Well, it's all about expectation. Ultimately, only 7 preferred the step mash beer compared to 5 preferred the decocted beer. And then 2 had no preference despite being able to tell a difference. So, that's basically split down the middle. And I don't think anyone was like, oh my God, this decocted beer is trash, or I cannot believe you step mash, this is gross. I think that people are like, they're both good. I guess I'd pick this one.
Right. And I did just look up the triple decoction experiment. It was a German Pils, and I'm looking at the triple decoction versus single infusion, and you look at the picture of those beers, and they look identical. There's no real color difference that I could tell. So again, fascinating finding there. I'm sure those beers tasted delicious, and he did use just German Pilsner malt. So make of that what you will, but I do think, again, it's fascinating that, you've got a single infusion versus triple decoction. People couldn't taste the difference. You got a step mash versus a double decoction, and people could. I can't help but wonder if there was something about the step mash, particularly that lower protein rest that you did, or whatever the steps you were, that didn't coax out some other compound that was, I don't know, in some way converted into something even as small as it might have been that some people could pick up or detect in those beers in the end. It's just a fascinating finding.
Right. Who knows? But I think at the end of the day, this does lend credence to the fact that, or the proposition that you might be able to get something unique and interesting, or at least different from a decoction. Given that taster preference was split, I don't think it's a make or break, but it's kind of fun to give it a try. It's a long brew day. I wouldn't recommend it to be every brew that you do, but it's a fun nod to tradition, and you can make a pretty good malty beer using that method.
Yeah, cool stuff. We do have a couple of reader comments. First one comes from Andreas Krenmer, who says, I think just the difference in OG between the two mashing methods shows one big impact of decoction mashing, namely that it makes more starch available that can be saccharide. Not that this is really relevant for homebrewers, especially when putting it in relation to the additional time and energy spent on boiling multiple decoctions, but interesting regardless. Now, Andreas Krenmer is a notable person for, I think, when it comes to brewing. I'll let you speak to that, Jordan.
Yeah, he's the guy that wrote the Vienna Lager book a couple years ago. And when you look at his research, he talks a lot about decoction in traditional Vienna Lager. I believe he decocts his homebrewed Vienna Lagers. So he's clearly a decoction fanboy. And I think his comment is fair. And I do agree that it would be fun to try to control for that and have a more similar OG. I don't know how you would feel about that, because I know you like to isolate the variables, but I think that there is a strong argument there, because effectively the OG is a function of the mashing method employed, and so modulating the amount of malt to make that more apples to apples is fair in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I also think, though, that let's not forget that part of that increased OG has to be related to the boil off during the decocting steps. You think about it, if you're doing a double decoction at 15 minutes per boil, that's 30 minutes of boiling. If you lose a gallon an hour, 4 quarts per hour or whatever, then ostensibly you're losing half a gallon of wort, or of liquid, right? Water, really, during those decoction steps. So it's not just that decoction will improve your conversion efficiency. It does that, but the boil time is going to impact that as well. I just think that's important to point out.
And I think for the purposes of the articles that we're producing, it is really interesting to expose the observable effect that the variable might have, just so people can go, oh yeah, look, it did increase the OG. Oh yeah, it did increase the attenuation and ultimately the ABV. And then maybe if we wanted to repeat this experiment, we could try to make those more similar. So we're no longer just trying to observe the effect it has on efficiency and OG, but more like a more apples to apples comparison, ostensibly.
Yeah, I agree. Final comment. It's actually more of a question, comes from somebody named Arthur, who says, I'm just wondering if there was any impact on foam stability. A lot of the reason people employ these step mash or decoction mashing is partially because of foam stability and stuff like that. We didn't comment on it earlier. Did you notice any differences in foam quality between these beers?
That was one thing I expected I might see, and I really didn't. In fact, they both had fantastic head formation and retention, and you really see that in the photo. It was kind of challenging to get a little 4-ounce pour, given how massive the heads were on these. And that's really authentic to the style. You want a few fingers of foam on your Tubinger of Czech Lager. I do have a Czech Lager faucet, and that can really dial in the foam, but I was getting crazy head even with just my standard Perlick taps on this. So I don't know if it's I guess maybe it's just the ingredients that were used, and ostensibly a step mash or a decoction were able to ultimately give us that foam levels, but incredible foam, and the decoction didn't seem to meaningfully improve it relative to a step mash.
I'm looking at those photos again. The foam looks like mousse. It looks absolutely gorgeous. So who knows what would have happened if it was if you compared it to a single infusion as well. Perhaps the malts that you used were what contributed to that. But regardless, fascinating results. And that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Do you have any final comments on step or decoction mashing before we wrap this one up?
Please give decoction a try on your next lager, be it a German lager, Czech lager, even an American lager. It's really fun but arduous brew day, and maybe you're going to make a better beer as a result. Maybe I will when I get my stuff up and running again, just to say that I've done it, so that I don't feel like a fool when people are talking about decoction mashing. It just seems like so much work for so little reward in the end, I guess, based on what I've had. But I do feel like, as a brewer of so many years, it's an honorable thing for me to take this one under my wing and actually give it a shot. So perhaps in the future I'll do that. Don't forget to check out the killer content that Martin is creating over at the Brewlosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy Podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy Podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.